Welcome to the ISF Podcast from the Information Security Forum. The ISF Podcast is hosted by ISF CEO Steve Durbin, and every episode he brings listeners features timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. Today we bring you the first in a two-part series with Dr. Andrea Matwishin, Penn State University professor of law. Andrea's work is at the intersection of technology design, innovation policy, and law. She and Steve discuss tech policy, regulation, and international cooperation, and what corporate boards can do differently to succeed in a world where tech is now integral to every business.
So, Andrea, thanks very much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for inviting me.
You're regarded as something of a leading authority on corporate information security regulation, commercial and consumer privacy law, and indeed technology law, of course. So let's start with a fairly broad brush question for you that I actually do get asked quite a lot by our members. And what's your assessment of the current state of corporate information security regulation worldwide?
I think we're heading in constructive directions, both from the standpoint of the way that the UK, the EU, and of course, my own home country of the United States are approaching things. We're seeing a heightened level of technical expertise within government. We're seeing increasing collaboration between the security research community and government as well, and an overall heightening of the level of knowledge in the private sector as well. And perhaps most recently and notably, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission passed rules around baselines of what I would call security competence in publicly traded companies, which, since I wrote an article advocating that in 2005, I'm really happy to see happening at this point in time. And that is a welcome evolution. But it is also true that there are still very basic deficits in many well-resourced companies even. So this is not just a problem of the most cash-strapped entities, but we still see publicly traded entities with multi-million-dollar, say, marketing budgets, choosing not to invest in robust security infrastructures, both from the standpoint of the security team and also from the corporate governance standpoint of giving the CISO, assuming there is a CISO, which in some cases there isn't, which is another point of concern, giving the CISO enough respect and functional oversight authority to be able to engage with the board and with the organization as a whole in order to ensure a culture of security becomes embedded to allow for that robust security mindset that simply has to exist in light of the reliance of today's modern corporation on information systems for core aspects of its work and its intangible asset protection and its infrastructure for harnessing internal human and other resources. But we still don't see many boards of directors that have someone with robust information security experience on board. And that is frankly a little surprising to me. I had hoped to see an information security trained person on every public company's board of directors at this point. And because the first generation of security professionals, it's not people who have formal credentials, because that didn't exist at the time when they and I were coming up through the academic and professional ranks in the late 90s, early 2000s. That's a thing, a creature, these certifications are a creature that came later. But those people are kicking around, and I'm not seeing major companies, publicly traded companies, chasing after them. Or frankly, me, I've gotten zero requests to sit on public boards, which I was also thinking that might have happened by this point, those people are not being pursued actively to sit on boards. And I'm surprised. I'm hoping the SEC rule encourages an assessment of the need for robust security frameworks, oversight, and thinking as an internal controls issue. So from my perspective as a former corporate lawyer, I guess once a corporate lawyer, always a corporate lawyer, I suppose. Maybe it's one of those things. When you look at all of these information control issues, this is as important as ensuring that you have the right accountant, that you have the right auditors for your financial statements. These questions are internal control questions. And the SEC hasn't quite framed it in this way in the US, but I would certainly expect other countries' financial regulators to, in the near future, or maybe they already have, engaged with these questions of security as basic internal control matters. Internal controls over the humans who touch information and manage it, and key corporate R&D and intangible assets, control over the systems themselves, control over who has access from the outside. So you have this combination of course, external threats and internal threats. And the internal piece of insider attacks is, I think, under-theorized as a matter of both information security theory and in the way that companies are self-reflective about their own needs for managing their systems and key intangible assets.
Is that, I mean, picking up on 2 points there, that first, the insider threat and also this lack of expertise in the boardroom, is that, do you think, partly down to lack of availability of resource, of skill sets, time, money, call it what you will? Or do you think it's more of a maturity thing? I mean, I'm thinking particularly, I suppose, when I say that about not having that skill set in the boardroom. I mean, when I talk to boards, typically still there is probably one individual that they will defer to when it comes to matters of information technology. And it's not a CIO or a CTO or anyone like that. It's somebody who's has had an interest in that particular space. And perhaps they have a similar role on another board that they're sitting on. But there is still almost this lack of understanding of, I suppose, the complexity of information security, the way in which it really does influence every element of business if you are in any way technology enabled. And so it is almost as if boards are somewhat still in denial, which again, I have to say, surprises me. Because like you, I was expecting a much larger rush towards trying to find people to sit on boards. So how do we overcome that challenge, I guess, is what I'm saying. Because, it has to start at that level in order for us to be able to address some of those more, insider-related threats that you're talking about.
I agree with your analysis. I think the Securities and Exchange Commission rule that is just now going into effect in the near future and was just voted out in the last few weeks, I think that will have a major push. But it's unfortunately going to require the force of law. So when we see enforcement activity, particularly by financial regulators and other regulators dealing with critical infrastructure, put in place baselines of care, such as having someone with expertise in the structuring of information security governance oversight systems. When you see that kind of a requirement, coupled with a robust threat modeling requirement, you start to transform the processes inside companies. That's why I'm sort of framing it repeatedly as an internal control problem, because that language is language that resonates with board members who oversee different pieces of operations. And it also resonates with, for example, the general counsel inside companies. So if it were a question of making sure that the warehouses are locked every night, and that the people who are in charge of, say, selecting payment processing methods and core financial services employees, those people are aware of their heightened responsibility because of the context that they're functioning in. And they view their roles as internal control roles to secure inventory, to secure financial systems, but they don't necessarily think of themselves as performing a security function. So helping existing employees, existing managers, officers, reframe their own roles to conceptualize security as part of their core duties. That language of internal controls helps a bit, but it really does, as you're saying, need to start from the top and with good questions about security coming from the board of directors and the officers in companies. And that top-down priority on security infrastructures and internal controls will permeate the organization slowly, but eventually, because the questions trigger a self-evaluative process. It's also why I'm a big fan of disclosure regimes. So when we look at, in the United States, for example, one of the most prominent disclosure regimes is the Securities and Exchange Commission disclosure regime around public companies' quarterly and annual returns. You look at a 10K and you have a set of questions that are answered by a team of people across different departments, different pieces of an organization. It creates a scaffold for collaboration in ways that are perhaps unintuitive to the corporation itself. You have the general counsel being very conscious of the accuracy of responses in those filings, because, of course, there is liability attached not only from the enforcement conduct of regulators, but also potentially from private litigants. And that general counsel, though not an expert necessarily in the production methodologies or in other core business pieces from a technical standpoint, can ask good questions to ensure that the information that is needed for market structures to function effectively is then fed up. That conversation around good security conversations inside organizations, it hasn't happened yet to the degree of robustness that the market needs. And these kinds of additional disclosure frameworks trigger those internal conversations. And so it's just a learning tool to push companies forward in that self-reflective, self-evaluative process. So I think more disclosure regimes like that, coupled with enforcement on the back end, are one concrete way that we will see legal frameworks moving forward and this kind of good scaffolding for internal controls to evolve around basic security processes inside companies to a greater degree.
Yeah, and I think, one thing I'd add to that is one of the things I'm certainly a fan of is organizations they can call it a health check, they can call it a benchmark, it doesn't really matter, but on an annual basis, just going from top to bottom, assessing their security posture, their security capability in light of what they're trying to do from an organizational standpoint, right? In terms of where they're going, from a strategic standpoint, from a new market entry standpoint, from a customer acquisition standpoint, from a product development perspective, so that you're actually embedding some of these principles into the way that the company is going about doing its business. But I guess it's all about the maturity or lack of maturity of the security industry and where it has come from, which is very much more that sort of technical aspect, I guess, rather than it being really firmly embedded in the way in which an organization goes about doing its business today. And one of the things as well, which I think will drive this, you've made a very valid points around the role of the SEC. But I think the other driver, for me anyway, is the fact that cybercrime isn't going to go away anytime soon. It's still a very big growth business. It's still impacting organizations very significantly. So from the perspective of policymakers, what exactly do you think needs to be done to improve cooperation between law enforcement and civil society, so academic institutions, for instance, corporations, non-profits, in the fight against cybercrime? Where can we go with that?
So in the United States context, and this is partially with an eye to international harmonization, I think that we need to perhaps step back and reframe the conversations around security, including those involving security crime, as a series of concentric circles. And this is a model that I'm borrowing from developmental psychology, which is what my PhD is in. So there's a wonderful psychologist named Yuri Bronfenbrenner, and he has this ecological model. And so applying it to the context of security, if you imagine as a core internal circle, the set of standards and security cultural norms that exist in a particular context, and layer onto that the next circle of local, municipal, state regulatory regimes. And then one circle out is national, federal regimes and enforcers. And then one more layer out is the broader goal of preserving democratic systems, of international collaboration, of creating secure infrastructures for the growth of global economies. And then think of each of those circles pushing on every other circle. So it's all connected and it's all influencing the evolution of each layer. Context, the nature of the harm, and the intent of each of the players within each of these circles then is an added layer of complexity. So it's a very messy picture. However, in the US context, what I think we need a technology regulator of last resort. So not a first recourse sort of agency, but instead a new agency or governmental organization that is a sort of traffic cop or crossing guard, or we can use whatever other direction helping metaphor we would like, that has basically three core functions. The first is this guiding function of harmonizing efforts across different agencies, organizations, whether it's the law enforcement needs in conversation with the consumer protection needs, with other interests that all get pulled together into a convening, a way to ensure that all of the different efforts inside government are heading in the same direction in ways that ultimately align with those big picture goals of democratic structure, support, and stability of systems. The second role involves robust enforcement and fining when there is a gap and no other agency can ensure that the corrective measure that needs to happen is happening. So in the way that in the US context, our various enabling statutes and regulatory regimes are set up, what has happened, and I say this as someone who works as an expert with government agencies, is that sometimes companies figure out how to game various regulatory regimes against each other or create ambiguity such that they can tie things up in litigation for extended periods of time. But in the world where a technology regulator of last resort, and yes, the abbreviation is TROLLER, that was intentional. I try to insert a little humor where I can. The TROLLER, the technology regulator of last resort, would enable, again, a coverage of the gap between or among the various agencies and help coordinate that response by providing technical support where needed and other streamlining functionality to more efficiently and effectively address the problem in technology policy that is impacting our society. And so this certainly would be an issue in security questions, but it would also help to ensure that other values are represented more broadly in other areas of technology policy, and all of that could get pulled into this regulator. The third key role for the technology regulator of last resort is international harmonization. And this is partially because when you look across the international system, you see many different structures of technology core regulators. So some countries have a technology minister, some countries have a technology agency, some countries have a particular appointed official. It looks different. And with the US structure, we are sometimes potentially at a disadvantage in our ability to effectively engage internationally on questions, especially on the civil side or the interaction of the civil and the criminal, going back to your original question, because when we come to the table, we generally have some experts from the State Department, some experts from the White House potentially, but we don't have a single point of contact from the standpoint of agency and department coordination. And what my friends who've been at that table tell me is that it results sometimes in a situation where that third person who is along doesn't necessarily have either the expertise for a part of the conversation, though they are obviously an expert in some parts of the conversation, or they can't speak for the relevant agencies that would be the correct actors in addressing whatever the problem is that our international partners bring to us. Because if you're, say, a technology minister, you have many different kinds of technology problems in your portfolio. Some of them may be security related. Some of them may be advanced threat actor related that don't just involve technology questions, but could involve different categories of potential responses that may not fall specifically into just one industry sector or one particular agency's remit in the US. So having a centralized coordinating agency, a technology regulator of last resort, would also address that technology international harmonization issue. So that's my modest proposal for where the United States should go. I think it would help to address the criminality issues that you're talking about because of its sort of interdisciplinary approach across agencies and across sectors.
Yeah, and I think across country as well, because, one of the things that really is very difficult for law enforcement is that whole nature of the fact that the cybercriminal operates somewhat freely cross-border, because the internet does not see borders. The dark web doesn't see borders. And so trying to bring some kind of collaboration mixed together, and it has got better. I think we have to say that, don't we? I mean, I think back maybe 10 years to some of the challenges that people like Interpol, the FBI were facing then, and compare it with where they are today. There's no question there's been significant improvement, but still a long, long way to go.
Thanks to today's guest, Dr. Andrea Matwishin. We'll be back next week with part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Matwishin. We'll be back with a new episode next week. In the meantime, if you would take 10 seconds to pull up this podcast on whatever device you're listening, give us a 5-star rating and write a quick review, we'd be grateful. You can also listen to the ISF Analyst Insight podcast, which goes in depth on the hottest topics in information security. In every episode, ISF analysts hand-select active security professionals from ISF member organizations to discuss how the implementation of ISF research is uniquely applied to their real-world context. We hope you'll listen, and of course, we'll put a link to that show in our show notes. If there's a topic or question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode, let us know at securityforum.org, which is also where you can find our catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like today's. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert, with senior producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Thanks for listening.